time to the Colorado River. I'm going to tell three stories and try to weave them together. But what impresses me about this river system is the continuity of change here. Things are happening all the time. New species showing up, some of them endangered, some of them non-native, and we never quite know what kind of a river we're next stepping into. So today I'm going to tell three stories about the how the flow regime changes in the river have affected the ecology there. We're going to talk about pre-dam to present situations, the effects of the dam on the tailwaters in Glen Canyon. That's not a reach that many of us get into very often, but it's becoming a very popular recreational spot. Of course, 10,000 people a year now doing kayaking from the dam down to Lee's Ferry. Almost insane, but lots going on in that reach. We don't hear much about it because it's not enriched with sediment. Kind of been written off by management as a lost cause, but some really interesting ecology going on. We'll talk about what the consequences of the dam are on the structure of the ecosystem up there, and then we're going to go down to Pete's Creek and see what we can learn about Pete's Creek from in relation to the dam. All right, so the effects of the dam on the food web in the Colorado River were long thought in post-dam time to be a function of what kind of algae grow on the floor of the river. Not just the algae, but the little tiny diatoms and microflora that grow on the algae. Some of you who are old enough remember when that whole reach of the river was floored with Cladophyra, long filamentous green, very rich in diatoms, which contain oil. And that's the real food base of the Colorado River. Everything trophically above those, the insects, the fish, and whatnot, are feeding on diatoms and single-celled algae that are living on the Cladophyra. This was a story from 1965 to the mid-90s at least, and then we imposed reduced flow fluctuations on the river. So now the daily flow fluctuations are only about half a meter versus the 2.5, 3, sometimes even greater meters of change, 10, 15 feet sometimes in some places. That kind of I grew up on that. So we in this PM time, we had very little suspended sediment. The water was clear, cold, and pretty highly varying on a daily basis. The diatoms shown there are diatoms that are living on the algae. That's the food base for the river. We had rainbow trout as big as 23 pounds in the river back in those days. No more. The diatoms were fed upon by the Gammarus studs, midges, a couple of worms, and Physidium or finger clams. They're still in the river. Native clams that are little tiny things. You normally wouldn't see it, but some of us do. Nowadays, after the mid-90s, the flows were stabilized considerably by the adaptive management program, and we end up with a very different river, even than we had before. We've taken this incredibly dynamic river, somewhat stabilized it from 1965 to 1995, and then today it's a very much more stabilized system. Stability in a formerly very disturbed system like this means there's lots of space for things to come in. We've got about half a dozen different species of algae that are now colonizing the river, each of them living in a different kind of environment. So in the summer months, you might have noticed a lot of drift coming out of that reach. If you're rigging your boat at these ferries, you see all kinds of vegetation floating by the river. Most of that is pondweed, Potamogeton, and quite a bit of a plant called Chara, C-H-A-R-A. And that is another alga that is really foul smelling. You pick up a piece of it and it really smells bleh. It forms kind of a crust as well. It's actually precipitating calcium carbonate. So those are the species that are dominant up there. And we have now on the floor of the river this bed of moss that never occurred there prior to about 1995 or so. Fontinalis is a dense bed of moss that goes from the dam all the way down to Lee's Ferry. Once the turbidity increases by the Paria, we lose that on the floor of the river. So you don't usually see that on the river trip, but it's a very dense, extensive stand of moss on the floor. we've been trying to tease apart what diatoms live on each of these different species because the flora has turned over enormously because of this transition that more or less went on when nobody was kind of paying attention to it. It's an example of a gradual change in the ecosystem. Comes on, you know, we're kind of all French, kind of frogs in a frying pan. Water's warming up and things are changing, but we don't really understand what's going on now. With John Ware and some of my other co-authors, we've been, he's at Fordham University in New York. We've been trying to put this story together because it's really a tremendous change in the very basic structure of the ecology. So far, we've got this major eruption of several species of plants in post-1995 time that has come in response to reduced flow fluctuation. The food base of the system, which are these epiphytic, they're living on the surface of diatoms and whatnot, has almost entirely turned over. Half the species we're finding weren't reported by very intensive studies by Dean Glynn here in the 1990s. And the plant assemblages are getting sorted by the kind of flows we have, the stage, what kind of substrata exists there. Now, a lot of which is quagga mussels. We dredge the bottom of the river there. One of the main things coming up is quagga mussel shells. So we've got the chance to look at a small high flow in 2021. It did a little bit of scour there, but it didn't really change. You can see some of the beautiful and not so beautiful algal forms there. Rock snot is at Ischemia. It's a pretty ugly stuff. It's really increasing quite dramatically in the warm temperatures. But what's so what? I mean, I guess so what? The so what of this is that all that organic material that's being produced now and not swept away decomposes. The floor of the river and also the reservoir upstream from the dam is highly anoxic now, meaning no oxygen. Bacteria have consumed all the oxygen. They're breaking down all this organic material that's being produced, and the floor of the river has gone anoxic. Not very nice. This is a pretty big change, and especially in the winter months when that the vegetation has kind of died back and settled out, you get these mud beds. So we did a project looking at the distribution of that anoxia, finding that below the lowest water line is where the anoxia really develops. If you expose the shorelines with a low flow for any length of time, the anoxia dissipates. But at depth there, it's a pretty black river. Also took a common mayfly. You all know about EPT, Ephemeroptera, the mayflies in the EPT formula. Took a common mayfly and subjected it to water that was just from the river versus water that had been filtered through the anoxia. So we're giving you kind of a dose of the anoxic water. And the red line there shows that the mayflies exposed to that environment died off quite quickly, as opposed to those just exposed to the river. So they could live in the river just fine, but with the anoxia, they're very much limited. And these are critters that live on the floor of the river directly in contact with the bed. How can we solve the problem? Well, not easily. Increasing the dissolved oxygen levels would knock these terra beds especially down. We could decrease mainstream temperature. It's a very different story than, say, all the emphasis that went into thinking about a thermal control device to warm the river back in the up until just a decade. But cooling the river temperature would keep these plants at bay. We could also increase the amount of scour. Having regular floods, totally important for moving these things out. That's part of the reason they didn't really occur in the pre-dam river development. And we could also think about trying to increase turbidity. Storing up the river would increase the river, would decrease the amount of light going in the river. So these are just some options that we threw out there because this is a kind of an unexplored change in the river system. Okay, we're going to jump down to Pete's Creek. Why to Pete's Creek? It occurred to me in doing some work that I did on Tapeats Creek that the flow patterns of Tapeats Creek are actually really remarkably similar to the mainstream. Not the volume of flow, but the continuity of flow. Very, very little flow fluctuation these days. But the water quality of Tapeats Creek is almost exactly what comes out of the dam. So the question then is, so what's in Tapeats Creek that's not in the mainstream river? which everybody knows pretty much, is that you've got these three groups, mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies, occurring in great abundance in Peach Creek, and they disappear as soon as that creek water hits the river. Why? If the water is so similar to the dam, why low EPT in the actual mainstream near it? So, spending most of the summer down there in some of the hottest environments I've ever had to do long-term work in, we chose six settings here. Joseph Holloway and I spent most of 2017 down there, choosing sampling sites that were the top one there, Beach Creek, unaffected by the river. The UVC is the burial zone that's hit by high flows and kind of stalled out there. All of our tributaries, all of our major tributaries in Grand Canyon create an island at the mouth. So we had and when you think about that, it's like, yeah, they all do. They all have a kind of a divergence channel, even the Korea. So the upstream outlet channel, UOC there, and DOC is the downstream, most of the water coming out the downstream. The lower Colorado River below the creek mouth, and the upper Colorado River above. We did a lot of stuff there. Looking at the water quality, the only strongly different variable there was electrical conductivity. It's about 3 times higher in the mainstream. And but otherwise, we did some experiments with the invertebrates in the creek to see how they would respond to higher salinity in the conditions. They all survived it just fine. Water quality did not look like a reason why we don't have this EPT, why we have this what's called a discontinuity, a difference between the creek and the river in terms of the invertebrates. So water quality and water temperature, the temperature of the creek is virtually the same as the mainstream there. So water quality and temperature are not responsible for this difference in the EPT. Okay, next thing is, what about fluctuating flows? How are you going to do that? Okay, in Prescott College, we had a standing joke about a course called underwater basket weaving. And Joseph and I actually kind of did a lot of underwater basket weaving. We created these baskets, put gravels in them, put them in the creek, and then watch, and then very carefully move them up and down each day, simulating fluctuating flows in the creek to see if fluctuating flows was doing the damage to the EPT. Did that in all those sites we were talking about there, and we were also doing a lot of sampling using a basket sampler of the habitats there. What we found in that, of course, is that the Beach Creek, the benthos, the floor of the stream is gravel, cobble, and very, very little sand, fine sediment. In contrast, the mainstream is large boulders, all embedded in sand. So if you look at the graph on the right side there, the red are the fine grains, silt and sand particles in across those different habitats. As you move from Beach Creek on the left, to Beach Creek here, going to the mainstream, great increase in sand. So great diversity of substrata here, and not so much out in the mainstream. The two habitats are quite different. Again, sampling and looking at the different critters that live in those environments. Red here are EPT, so all the stoneflies, mayflies, and caddisflies in the creek. As you get out to the river, they dissipate. Both the density and the number of species changes like that. Very abrupt drop off at the mouth of the Beach Creek, and in the river, very, very little. So the basket samplers with this fluctuating flow experiment that we did to simulate what's going on in the river versus what's going on in the creek showed us two patterns. Again, this pattern, the red here are EPT, and good abundance of EPT in the baskets that were colonized in the creek, and less so in the river. But when we put the right habitat into the river, the Beach Creek and the river could each support these different species. So that was these EPT species. That was really informative, because if you have the right habitat, that means you can have these species in the river. So with that, we look at the absence of these, especially the EPT species in the mainstream, is due to the amount of sand in the river. There's no interstitial space under the rocks for these critters to live, so therefore they can't be there. There's a couple of exceptions, of course, but for the most part, there's just not the habitat. So it's not water quality, not water temperature, not flow fluctuation that's doing it. It's really this business of embeddedness in fine grains. So we have a statement in our paper on this. I brought a copy of it back there. Anybody wants to see it, more than welcome to send you a copy. Come on. But not all the desired ecosystem conditions, meaning we want a lot of sand, perhaps we want a lot of these aquatic invertebrates in the river. Not all of those conditions can be simultaneously achieved. We're managing mostly for sand for all of us and for our clients, but that is not very conducive to the existence of EPT. Expanding this a little bit, so at the dam, stabilized lower wormer releases, several non-native mollusks here have all increased the macrophyte production. That macrophyte production and decomposition is leading to anoxia in the floor of the river, and then this creates great new problems and uncertainties for how you manage the ecosystem. The solutions, again, somehow increasing the dissolved oxygen. That could be an engineering solution at the dam. Increasing the amount of flooding we have. Whenever we have an opportunity for flooding, flush the system if we can. If there are ways to increase turbidity and decrease the water temperature, those are management directions that would at least help with the condition of the ecosystem in Plain Canyon. Again, all these are kind of changes going on in a system that we start to pay attention over time. The picture becomes a little clearer over time. The ecosystem in my 50 years of looking at it has gone through enormous changes. You know, the arrival of bald eagles, the loss of half a dozen different vertebrate species in the system, the recovery of some of our native fish, and then the introduction of so many non-native species. The app that Jerry was talking about earlier is a chance to bring more attention to those species. So we want to really emphasize. I think that this is a system that is in constant change. We go down there and have such a life-changing experience, and we never are stepping in the same river twice. Thank you very much.
We have time for 1 or 2 questions if you have some for Larry.
It might be too late in the afternoon for questions about bugs.
Will you be around so they can talk with you later?
Sure, yeah. You want to find out more about some of the bugs? We have our new dragonflies of Grand Canyon up on the table in the back right corner.
Wonderful. Larry, thank you.
All right, up next is Charles Zakulik. The times, they are a changing fish in the Grand Canyon.